For nearly 2 years, this war was governed by a lie, not a spoken lie. A strategic one. The belief was simple. If Ukraine crossed certain lines, Russia would respond with catastrophic force, nuclear force, uncontrollable escalation, global consequences. And because of that belief, everyone hesitated. Tonight, that belief collapsed in 6 hours. No nuclear response, no immediate retaliation, no red lines enforced, instead silence. What you witnessed was not just a strike. It was the moment fear lost its authority. And when fear stops working, entire systems begin to unravel. Washington didn't panic because Ukraine acted. Washington reacted because the framework it relied on no longer holds. This was a test of deterrence, of credibility, of whether threats still shape reality, and the result was unmistakable. If you want to understand why this moment feels different, why leaders are recalculating in real time, you need to follow the logic, not the noise. Stay with me. Because before we talk about what comes next, we must first define the problem everyone was trying to avoid. To understand why this moment matters, you need to understand the problem Western leaders believed they were managing. This war was never only about territory. It was about control, specifically control over escalation. From the very beginning, policy in Washington, London, and Berlin revolved around a single question. How far can Ukraine go before Russia does something irreversible? Every decision flowed from that fear. Every weapon system, every restriction, every delay. So the conflict was placed inside an invisible box. Ukraine could defend, Ukraine could respond, but Ukraine could not fundamentally threaten the systems Russia relied on to project power. That box was not created by Russian capability alone. It was reinforced by Western anxiety, the assumption that Russia's nuclear threats imposed real limits on action. And as long as that assumption held, Russia didn't need to escalate. It only needed to threaten. That was the equilibrium. Unstable, tense, but predictable. What happened today didn't just shake that balance. It removed the box entirely. And once the box disappears, the logic of the war changes with it. Now, we need to go back briefly and understand how this framework was built in the first place. To see how we arrived here, we have to return to the early logic of this war. In February 2022, Vladimir Putin assumed speed would decide everything. Ukraine would collapse in days. NATO would fracture in weeks. Nuclear threats would freeze Western decision-making indefinitely. This wasn't bravado. It was a strategic model rooted in Cold War reflexes. The model worked at first. Russia's nuclear posture didn't need to be credible in action. It only needed to be credible in imagination. Western leaders, haunted by worst-case scenarios, built policy around avoiding a catastrophe that had never occurred, and in doing so, they unintentionally rewarded coercion. Each escalation warning achieved its purpose. Each red line narrowed Ukraine's operational freedom. Each hesitation reinforced Moscow's leverage. Over time, this created a perverse stability. Russia could wage a conventional war under the protection of nuclear ambiguity. Ukraine could fight, but only within limits defined by someone else's fear. This wasn't deterrence as balance. It was deterrence as paralysis. And like all systems built on fear rather than facts, it depended on one fragile condition, that no one ever tested it. Today, that condition no longer exists. And once a system is tested, it either holds or it breaks. The first real crack didn't come from diplomacy. It came from action. What unfolded was not loud at first. It was fast, compressed, precisely sequenced. And that is why it mattered. In a matter of hours, Ukraine struck assets that were never supposed to be touched, not symbolic targets, not expendable ones. Infrastructure that sits at the core of Russian strategic power projection. Facilities Moscow had explicitly framed as untouchable. And then nothing happened. No immediate retaliation, no dramatic escalation, no enforcement of the threats that had shaped policy for 18 months. Instead, confusion, emergency meetings, silence. That silence was the crisis. Because deterrence only functions when the threatened response is believable. The moment Russia failed to act decisively, the psychological architecture of the war began to collapse. Not gradually, instantly. This was not Ukraine taking a risk. It was Ukraine exposing a risk that already existed and showing that it had been overstated. If you are trying to understand why analysts suddenly began using words like irreversible and existential, this is why. When red lines are crossed and nothing happens, they stop being red lines. They become memories. And that realization forces a much deeper question, one that goes beyond this single strike. So now we have to ask, what exactly was holding this system together all along? What held this system together was never raw military power. It was belief, specifically, the belief that escalation was a one-way street, that if Ukraine climbed too high, Russia would inevitably respond with something catastrophic: nuclear weapons, NATO confrontation, a global shock no one could control. But here is the mechanism most people missed. Russia did not enforce red lines through action. It enforced them through anticipation. Western policy was built on managing what Russia might do, not what Russia had actually done. That distinction matters, because it meant Moscow didn't need to escalate to shape outcomes. It only needed to maintain uncertainty. This is how coercive deterrence works in theory. You amplify fear. You exploit risk aversion. You let others restrain themselves for you. For a long time, it worked. Ukraine adjusted. The West hesitated. And Russia fought a conventional war under the shadow of threats it never had to fulfill. But systems based on anticipation are fragile. The moment someone tests the threat and survives, the illusion collapses. Fear stops being a constraint and becomes a liability. That is what changed. Ukraine didn't just strike targets. It struck the assumption that hesitation equals safety. And once that assumption breaks, every calculation must be rebuilt from the ground up. Which brings us to the second and far more dangerous moment of crisis. The second crisis was not about what Ukraine did. It was about what Russia didn't do. After the strike, the world waited for the response that was supposed to restore order. The missiles, the escalation, the proof that the old rules still applied. Instead, Moscow hesitated. There were meetings in the middle of the night, emergency consultations, closed rooms filled with urgency but not action. Russia did not escalate vertically. It did not widen the war. It did not reach for the instruments it had warned everyone about. And that hesitation mattered more than any explosion, because when a system built on fear reaches its moment of truth, delay is exposure. Silence becomes evidence. And restraint, when it was never promised, signals weakness. This is the danger zone. A cornered power that realizes its threats no longer work faces only two options: reckless escalation or strategic retreat. Both are unstable, both carry enormous risk. Ukraine understood this. Its operation wasn't just forceful. It was timed to exploit confusion. Follow-on actions amplified disarray. Tempo accelerated while Moscow paused. That sequencing sent a message far louder than any statement. Ukraine was no longer reacting. It was dictating the rhythm. And when control of tempo shifts in war, power shifts with it. The consequences of that shift don't stay on the battlefield. They reach people, societies, lives. And that's where we have to go next. Now, let me bring this closer to you. Because when strategic frameworks collapse, they don't collapse in conference rooms. They collapse in everyday life. For years, you were told this war had limits, that escalation was being managed, that restraint was protecting stability. But what today revealed is that much of that restraint was never protecting you. It was protecting an illusion. While leaders debated red lines, you absorbed the consequences. Higher prices, energy insecurity, anxiety about what might come next. A lingering sense that the world was drifting towards something dangerous and no one was fully in control. What Ukraine demonstrated today is unsettling, but also clarifying. It showed that fear had been shaping policy more than facts. And when fear governs decisions, ordinary people always pay the price first. You deserve honesty about the risks you're living with. You deserve leaders who respond to reality, not just to worst-case scenarios imagined years ago. This moment forces a reckoning, not just for generals and presidents, but for societies that have been told to accept uncertainty as normal. If this analysis helps you see the deeper structure behind the headlines, stay with me, share it, question it, engage with it. Because what happens next won't be decided only by missiles or meetings. It will be shaped by whether people understand what truly changed today. And that change doesn't stop at national borders. Once this shift crossed Ukraine's borders, it became a global problem. Because deterrence is not local. It is systemic. Every alliance, every security guarantee, every unresolved conflict now has to be reevaluated through a new lens. If nuclear threats fail to enforce restraint in Europe, what do they mean elsewhere? If red lines dissolve under pressure, who redraws them and on what authority? This is why capitals far from the battlefield reacted so quickly. Not out of solidarity, out of calculation. The credibility of nuclear coercion has been a silent pillar of global order for decades. Remove even part of that pillar, and the structure above it begins to wobble. Allies reassess commitments. Rivals reassess risks. Neutral states reassess alignment. This is the chain reaction Western leaders fear but can no longer ignore. Ukraine's action didn't destabilize the system by force alone. It destabilized it by proving that long-standing assumptions may no longer hold. And once that realization spreads, it doesn't stay contained. Global security is not governed by intentions. It's governed by precedents. And tonight, a new precedent entered the system. That brings us to the most difficult question of all. Where does this lead? Because from here, the future splits clearly into three paths. From this point forward, the future no longer moves in a straight line. It branches. The first path is stabilization. In this scenario, Russia absorbs the shock, quietly accepts the new limits of its leverage, and shifts toward containment rather than escalation. Ukraine continues degrading military capacity. The war becomes less about dramatic breakthroughs and more about managed decline. It is not peace, but it is control. The second path is prolonged instability. Russia responds asymmetrically. Cyber operations, political sabotage, proxy actions designed to restore fear without triggering direct confrontation. The conflict stretches on, unpredictable, draining, and corrosive. No decisive collapse, no clean resolution, just erosion. The third path is the most dangerous. A leadership that feels humiliated, exposed, and cornered chooses escalation not because it is rational, but because it feels necessary. History tells us this is how catastrophic decisions are made. Not from confidence, from desperation. Which path emerges depends on one variable above all others, whether Russia accepts that its threats no longer define reality or attempts to prove that they still do. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Ukraine has already chosen its path. It is acting as if the old constraints are gone. Now the question is whether the rest of the world is prepared to live in the system that follows. Because once a strategic illusion collapses, there is no return to comfort, only adjustment. And that brings us to the final reckoning, what this moment ultimately demands. What happened today was not a battlefield event. It was a psychological rupture. For nearly 2 years, this war was contained by fear. Fear of what might happen if someone went too far. That fear shaped policy, delayed decisions, and constrained action. And tonight, it was exposed for what it was, an assumption that no longer holds. Ukraine didn't end the war today, but it ended the illusion that threats alone can control outcomes. Russia now faces a reality it tried desperately to avoid. Its red lines were crossed, its warnings were tested, and the response that was supposed to follow never came. That doesn't signal strength. It signals a system running out of options. For the West, this is a moment of responsibility. You can't unsee what has been revealed. You can't pretend the old framework still works. The question now is whether leaders adapt or cling to caution that no longer protects anyone. And for you, the viewer, This is where awareness matters. If you want to understand how power really shifts, how wars actually change, and why this moment will be studied long after the noise fades, stay engaged. Share this analysis, challenge assumptions, keep asking uncomfortable questions. Because this story isn't ending, it's entering a new phase, and the rules are being rewritten whether we are ready or not.